World leaders this week convened at the United Nations headquarters in New York for the annual General Assembly. But as they met to discuss and front solutions for the crises that confront continents, the UN systems have been criticized as being unequal to the challenges of our times. Among reforms fronted are for a more inclusive and representative UN Security Council. A behemoth of an institution, the United Nations has been around for just about 79 years. Formed after World War II, the UN officially came into existence following ratification of its charter by China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and the United States, who make up 5 permanent members of the Security Council and who are allies in the war. Its purpose, prevent another world war. But with the escalating conflicts around the world, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe and on the African continent, the UN architecture is increasingly coming under criticism for its impotence. Kenya among those clamoring for a reform of the institution.
The world's most powerful states have increasingly chosen unilateralism and militarization over dialogue and diplomacy. As a consequence, the capacity of our multilateral institutions to maintain and enforce peace, even in national crises with significant regional impacts, is severely undermined.
Even with regard to the climate crisis, the UN has shown itself incapable of holding its member states to account.
What goes on in the minds of those who prioritize economic returns over people? Ladies and gentlemen, what really happened to humanity?
Circumstances that renewed calls for greater inclusion at the apex.
The Council is, by all intents and purposes, dysfunctional, undemocratic, non-inclusive, unaccountable, autocratic, and at best, opaque. An institution that excludes 54 African countries with 1.4 billion people, while allowing one nation to veto decisions of the remaining 193 member states in the 21st century, is simply unacceptable.
Placing the fate of the world's security in the hands of a select few when it is the vast majority of the peoples of the world who bear the brunt of the various threats is unjust, unfair, and unsustainable.
2 years ago, President Biden announced that the United States supports expanding the Security Council to provide permanent representation for countries from Africa, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, that in addition to the countries we long supported for permanent seats, India, Japan, and Germany. We've been very, very clear that we do not support expansion of the veto.
But there are those who argue that before Africa can demand a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, let alone 2 as proposed by the US, it must get its house in order. The AU relies on external partners for funding as member states fail to meet their obligations. And even as African member states agitate for an opening up of the democratic space at the UN Security Council, their record of holding up the same ideals within their own borders are dismal. As promised, I'm joined by Ambassador Martin Kimani, who sat on the very same UN Security Council. I believe, Ambassador, you were president in the month of October. Was it 2021 Kenya was?
Yes. Good evening. I was. We were in the Security Council in 2021 and 2022, and I served as a president of the Security Council in October of 2021.
All right, so this is a subject on which you've been tweeting, or is it now Xing? And in fact, you even caught the attention of Rwanda's President Paul Kagame. Why? Because I got the impression that you feel it is premature for Africa to be awarded 2 seats as proposed by President Joe Biden on the UN Security Council, permanent seats, that is.
No, I don't think it's premature. And certainly Africa has been, there are 3 African seats in the Security Council. I think the argument by Africa has been that we want permanent seats with the right of veto, unless the veto is removed for everybody. So it's not premature. I think my comment on social media was that Africa cannot get these seats as an act of charity. It needs to be an assertion of African interests and leverage so that Africa goes to the Security Council to do something with the permanent seats, not merely to sit on them permanently. And that requires Africa to be resolute in how it reforms its own peace and security architecture so that it dovetails with the Security Council. Africa has not been ready to implement the reforms that it has agreed for itself. And so going to the Security Council without restructuring how we protect peace and security in Africa will essentially be mere inclusion and not empowerment.
So the response to your posts, President Kagame talked about having the AU occupy one of those seats and then have the other one be rotational. What do you make of that proposal?
Well, President Kagame I think he started a great discussion that I think is going to pick up momentum in the months and years to come. He said that the African Union should have a seat, African Union Commission, and that the other seat should revolve between different countries. Now that is not yet the official position of the African Union. The African Union has kept its demands to number of seats, as opposed to who would fill them. And the fear is that the fight over the countries that would become permanent members would disunite Africa a great deal.
All right, but I also got the impression, just looking at your writing on the subject, that you feel that AU reforms should take precedence.
Olive, Africa is having a crisis of leadership. What else can we call it when Sudan is being torn apart, when the Sahel is in desperate trouble, the Horn of Africa is hurtling towards war? This is a time for African leadership to emerge. If Africans cannot resolve to do what they have to do to protect their own peace and security, then it really calls into question the leadership we have on the continent and its ability to rally. Now, by the time you make claims in the UN Security Council, while not able to actually even engage on peace building and the conflict prevention in our own neighborhood, how would we use these permanent seats if we cannot use the architecture we have now?
All right. And just speaking generally, do you feel that the UN system remains fit for purpose? Because the argument by various leaders are that conflicts have escalated across the globe, that member states have not met their obligations where climate change commitments are concerned.
Have you ever heard of the saying, a poor workman blames his tools? Look, the UN has been dysfunctional since the day it was created. The UN has always suffered a gap in confidence. The UN has always been riven by rivalries. There are no good old days of the United Nations. There were times when it was more effective. But the UN becomes effective because there's leadership to lead it. It's not just a question of reforms. The UN, with the instruments it has now, can do a more than adequate job. The problem of the UN is not lack of reforms. The problem of the UN is lack of resolve. And that resolve needs to be brought by political leaders. But worldwide, political leaders are more interested in narrow, and short-sighted agendas. We have lost the Africa of Meles Zenawi, of Thabo Mbeki, of Obasanjo. We need that Africa back. And we need that leadership back more than this constant talk of reforms, which is just a form of hiding from the lack of leadership.
Speaking of a lack of leadership, is the problem that the UN system is not representative? Because there has been the argument, even from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that when the UN was formed, when these systems were set up, Africa was still under colonial rule. There is a sense that the global south is not represented. For example, on the UN Security Council, where the permanent seats are concerned, there are only 5, and even the powers that are Japan, are not represented, where the 5 permanent seats are concerned with veto power.
Olive, it's certainly true that most African countries were not independent at the time that the UN was created. And the 5 seats are the winners of World War II. And that is the architecture that was built at the time. Should there be African seats? Absolutely. And would that make for a more effective Security Council? Not necessarily. What matters is, one, the expansion of the Security Council would certainly be a good thing. The change of global governance, whether it's a reform of the international financial institutions and how global decision-making is made, certainly needs changes. My point is that those changes are not going to come because the powerful are ready to give them. They're going to come because the rest are resolved and united enough in pursuing them. And so I am waiting for the American invitation to be taken up by African leadership to see whether African leadership can be truly visionary and strategic when it comes to pursuing Security Council reform.
The Security Council has been accused of being indecisive. Is the problem with the veto power?
If today there was no veto power on the Security Council, then the major powers would walk away from the Security Council. The Security Council does suffer from the veto because with the veto, one member of the permanent 5 is able to stop what most countries and most people believe to be the most reasonable course of action. So, for instance, the vetoes following the Russian invasion of Ukraine by Russia were taken with a lot of frustration by countries that thought a participant in a war should not be prosecuting in the Security Council on behalf of itself with a veto. At the same time, the vetoes by the United States protecting Israel's assault on Gaza have been deeply frustrating to the membership. And there are now proposals that the veto should either be able to be overcome by a large proportion of votes in the General Assembly, or that the veto should not be used in situations where there are atrocities and massive abuses against human rights and even acts of genocide. And that's a French-Mexican proposal. Of course, the problem with all the proposals against the veto is that the veto holders can veto that proposal. And so I have huge doubts that the veto is going to go anywhere. The question is, if African countries got the veto, what would they do with it?
All right. Haiti was big on President William Ruto's agenda. In fact, he stopped by there before heading to New York on leaving the country. He called for more support. He thanked the U.S., he thanked Canada, but he said that the challenge with getting 2,500 boots on ground by January is that they have a shortfall where equipment and financing is concerned. Do you think his call to action will be of success?
Olive, I personally think I am so proud of our policemen, Kenyan policemen. Whatever it is that the shortfalls they have at home, certainly their deployment really shows Kenyan solidarity at its best. But as President Ruto said, that mission is under-equipped and under-resourced. And hard questions need to be asked is why would we have agreed to a deployment that is under-resourced and under-equipped? Secondly, where is the international community, and particularly the United States that pushed so hard for this deployment? Thirdly, I think it's important to not oversell what the Kenyan police can do in Haiti. Haiti is a complex country with profound problems, and a contingent of police officers is beyond the ability, or it's beyond the ability of a contingent of police officers to solve Haiti's problems. What is required is for there to be concerted action on the political front that uses the opportunity of the Kenyan police and others, giving the political class room to breathe from the gangs, and then crafting a political structure, a government, an election that takes Haiti towards stability. But the Kenyan police on their own cannot change Haiti. And any attempts to sell that as an agenda, to overpromise, will lead to a painful strategic situation.
I believe the mandate ends, the multinational security missions mandate ends next month, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, there will be debates in the Security Council on whether to renew the mandate of the MSS. There is a desire by the United States and some other countries in the Security Council to change this from an MSS mission to a United Nations peacekeeping mission. And the reason for that is simply, again, the issue of resources. If it becomes a UN peacekeeping mission, then it will be paid for using assessed contributions from all member states. But the Russians and the Chinese and others in the Council are very reluctant to give a mandate. So we'll see how it plays out. We'll see how good Kenyan diplomacy is in working with the Americans to actually see whether this can be rehearted into a UN peacekeeping mission. And just quickly to be aware, the last UN peacekeeping mission to Haiti left in very bad conditions. And to this day, there's a massive gap of trust in Haiti when it comes to the blue helmets. So the attempt to reheart is basically turning back the clock, and is going to be very difficult, not only the Security Council, but if it succeeds, even on the streets of Haiti. Will they succeed? We have to see, and it has to be done very differently from the way it was done last time.
All right. Lastly, Ambassador, before I let you go, as President William Ruto was heading to New York and calling for humanity, there was a cloud of the protests that we witnessed earlier this year and how they were handled by police. What do you make of how he handled questions to do with that on the global stage?
Well, the last time I appeared on Citizen, I actually forgot to say something, which is I am exceptionally proud of young Kenyans. And young Kenyans have shown us their courage, their integrity, and their desire to transform Kenya. And I think they should be applauded by everybody. And I think they are being applauded and respected. Now, the response which did lead to young Kenyans being injured and some being killed is deeply unfortunate. And my hope is that it has not deeply damaged Kenya's image abroad. President Ruto was being asked tough questions on CNN, and he was answering them. I think beyond an interview, I think the world will be waiting to see how the voice and desires of young Kenyans for transformed governance are respected by the political class.
All right, thank you for speaking to us this evening, Ambassador Martin Kimani. There he has served in various capacities within the UN system and is currently the executive director. You can see on his name tag there, the Center for International Cooperation at New York University. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will continue to engage you moving forward. And on that note, we take a break on Citizen Weekend, but coming up,